They burst into laughter the moment she walked into the weapons training facility at Fort Meridian. "Look at those tiny hands," one of them snorted, barely containing his amusement. "She'll never even be able to grip an M4 properly, let alone field strip one." The jokes kept coming, each one more dismissive than the last, as they watched her petite frame navigate between the training tables laden with military hardware. But 15 minutes later, when Specialist Riley Vance placed that same M4 rifle in her hands and challenged her to field strip it blindfolded in under 30 seconds, something extraordinary happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The room fell completely silent as she disassembled that weapon. With movements so fluid, so precise, so impossibly fast that seasoned military instructors stopped mid-conversation to stare. 15 seconds. That's all it took for her to reduce a complex assault rifle to its component parts without even seeing what she was doing. 15 seconds to transform from the subject of mockery into someone who had just accomplished something that most of these soldiers couldn't do with their eyes wide open and unlimited time. Want to know how someone they dismissed as too delicate for real military work became the most formidable weapons expert anyone in that room had ever witnessed? Want to discover what happened when they realized that those same tiny hands they mocked belonged to someone with skills that defied everything they thought they knew about physical capability and military expertise? Hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story will change how you think about judging people based on appearances forever. Let's begin at the beginning, because what happened that morning at the Westbrook Military Training Complex wasn't just about one woman proving her critics wrong. It was about the dangerous assumptions we make when we look at someone and decide what they're capable of based on nothing more than physical appearance. It was about the moment when prejudice collided headfirst with reality and reality won. In the most spectacular way possible, the early morning mist still clung to the training grounds of Fort Meridian, one of the military's premier weapons training facilities nestled in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. This wasn't some basic boot camp operation. This was where the military sent their most promising personnel for advanced weapons certification, tactical training, and specialized combat preparation. The kind of place where careers were made or broken, where reputation meant everything, and where respect was earned through demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Inside Building C7, the Advanced Weapons Systems Training Center, the air hummed with the controlled chaos of military precision. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across rows of stainless steel tables, each one meticulously arranged with various firearms, ammunition, and training equipment. The scent of gun oil and metal polish hung heavy in the air, mixed with the institutional smell of military-grade cleaning supplies and the faint aroma of strong coffee from the break room that nobody had time to visit. It was 0730 hours on a Tuesday morning in October, and instructor certification course Delta 7 was about to begin. This particular course was legendary among military personnel, a grueling 3-week program that would either certify participants as advanced weapons instructors or send them back to their units with a clear understanding that not everyone was cut out for elite military training roles. The failure rate hovered around 60%, and that was for people who came in with already impressive military credentials. 12 candidates had been selected from across different branches of the armed forces. Most were men in their late 20s or early 30s, each one carrying themselves with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being among the best at what they did. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, the kind of physical presence that announced military competence before they even touched a weapon. They'd earned their spots through years of exemplary service, exceptional marksmanship scores, and recommendations from commanding officers who considered them the cream of the crop. Then there was Corporal Jade Nakamura, 5 feet 3 inches. Tall, weighing maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, with hands that looked like they'd be more comfortable holding a violin than a military rifle. Her uniform was regulation perfect, pressed with military precision, but it seemed to hang on her small frame in a way that emphasized just how different she was from every other person in that room. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, not a strand out of place, and her dark eyes held a calm intensity that most people missed because they were too busy focusing on what they perceived as physical inadequacy. As she took her assigned position at Training Station 7, the whispered comments began almost immediately. Voices that thought they were being discreet, but carried clearly in the metal-walled room designed for acoustic precision. Is this some kind of diversity initiative? Maybe she's here for administrative support or something. Those hands. Seriously. How is she supposed to handle military-grade weapons? This is going to be interesting to watch. I give her 2 days before she requests a transfer. The comments weren't necessarily mean-spirited. These were professional soldiers after all. Not high school bullies. But they carried the unconscious bias of people who had spent their entire careers in an environment where physical size and strength were often the most visible indicators of capability. They looked at Jade Nakamura and saw someone who didn't fit their mental image of what a weapons expert should look like, and they made assumptions accordingly. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed by looking at her, was that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally challenge every assumption they'd ever made about the relationship between physical appearance and military competence. Because in exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds, Corporal Jade Nakamura was going to demonstrate that sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities come in the most unexpected packages, and it all started with a simple challenge involving an M4 carbine, a blindfold, and 15 seconds that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Advanced Weapons Systems Training Center at Fort Meridian wasn't just another military facility. It was where legends were born and careers were defined. Built in 1987 during the height of Cold War tensions, the complex sprawled across 43 acres of Tennessee. Hills, its low-profile concrete buildings designed to withstand everything from natural disasters to direct attacks. The entire installation operated under security protocols that made most classified facilities look like public libraries. Building C7 stood at the heart of the complex, a fortress of reinforced concrete and steel that housed the most sophisticated weapons training equipment the military had ever assembled. The main training hall stretched nearly 200 feet from end to end, with 30-foot ceilings that accommodated everything from small arms practice to explosive ordnance demonstrations. Sound-dampening panels lined every surface, creating an environment where the sharp crack of gunfire became a muffled pop in conversations, carried with crystal clarity. The morning sun filtered through reinforced windows set high in the eastern wall, casting geometric patterns across the polished concrete floor. Each training station was a marvel of military engineering. Adjustable height tables with built-in tool storage, weapon mounting systems that could accommodate everything from sidearms to crew-served weapons, and integrated timing systems that tracked performance down to hundredths of a second. Digital displays mounted above each station showed real-time metrics, completion times, accuracy ratings, efficiency scores that determined who advanced and who went home. The air recycling system hummed constantly in the background, maintaining precise temperature and humidity levels that prevented weapon condensation and ensured consistent performance conditions. Even the lighting was calibrated. Full-spectrum LED arrays that eliminated shadows and color distortion, creating an environment where the smallest mechanical details were visible with perfect clarity. This wasn't a place where mistakes were tolerated or mediocrity accepted. Every surface, every tool, every piece of equipment reflected the military's commitment to absolute precision. The weapon racks along the north wall held examples of every small arm currently in service, each one maintained to factory specifications and test-fired weekly to ensure perfect operation. Ammunition storage followed protocols so strict that accessing even training rounds required biometric verification and dual authorization. In the observation deck 20 feet above the main floor, a wall of monitors displayed feeds from dozens of cameras positioned throughout the facility. Every movement, every technique, every split-second decision was recorded and analyzed by instructors who had spent decades perfecting the art of military weapons training. This was where reputations were built or destroyed, where the military's elite came to prove they belonged among the absolute best. The morning light streaming through the facility's reinforced windows caught the small details that revealed her true nature to anyone who knew what to look for. Calluses on her fingertips that came from years of working with precision mechanisms. A slight discoloration on her right index finger that suggested extensive contact with gun oil and metal polish. Muscle definition in her forearms that spoke of activities requiring fine motor control under resistance rather than simple strength training. When Master Sergeant Torres called for final equipment preparation, Jade moved into position with movements that were economical, purposeful, and somehow different from everyone else in the room. She wasn't trying to prove anything or establish dominance. She was simply ready for whatever came next, with the quiet confidency of someone who had spent years preparing for moments exactly like this one. Staff Sergeant Blake Morrison had been dominating conversation since the moment he'd walked through the doors at 0645 hours, 15 minutes before the official start time. At 6 feet 2 inches and built like a linebacker who'd spent the last decade lifting weights between combat deployments, he commanded attention simply by existing in the same room as other people. His uniform bore the kind of deployment patches and commendation ribbons that told a story of multiple tours in hostile territory, specialized training certifications, and the kind of combat experience that most soldiers only heard about in briefings. Morrison's voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never encountered a military challenge he couldn't overcome through a combination of physical strength, aggressive determination, and the kind of battlefield experience that made training exercises feel like recreational activities. He'd been holding court near Training Station 3, regaling a growing audience with stories from his last deployment to the mountain regions of Afghanistan, where his unit had been responsible for training local forces in advanced weapons systems and counterinsurgency tactics. "I'm telling you," Morrison was saying, his voice pitched to carry across the room without seeming like he was trying to be overheard. These local fighters had been using AK-47s their whole lives, but they'd never seen anything like American precision weapons. "First time I put an M4 in this village elder's hands, the guy couldn't even figure out how to release the magazine. Took me 20 minutes just to teach him basic field stripping, and that was with full visual demonstration and hands-on guidance." Group around him laughed appreciatively, recognizing both the humor and the subtle assertion of Morrison's expertise. These weren't inexperienced soldiers. Every person in the room had earned their place through demonstrated competence in their respective specialties. But Morrison's stories carried the weight of someone who had not only mastered military weapon systems but had taught those skills to others under actual combat conditions, where mistakes meant casualties rather than simply failed training scores. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez nodded along with Morrison's story while simultaneously managing his own subtle display of credentials. Rodriguez had spent 8 years as a weapons instructor at Fort Benning, where he'd trained thousands of soldiers in small arms proficiency and advanced marksmanship techniques. His approach was more technical than Morrison's battlefield-focused narrative, but equally effective at establishing his position in the room's informal hierarchy. The thing about weapons training, Rodriguez added when Morrison paused for effect, is that it's not just about knowing how the systems work. It's about understanding them at a level where you can troubleshoot problems under pressure. I've seen soldiers who could field strip an M4 in their sleep, but put them in a stress situation with a weapon malfunction, and suddenly they're fumbling around like recruits. The conversation naturally evolved into a comparison of training techniques and deployment experiences, with each participant contributing stories that demonstrated their expertise, while subtly competing for recognition as the most qualified person in the room. The dynamic was familiar to anyone who had spent time in military environments, professional soldiers establishing pecking order through casual displays of knowledge and experience. Technical. Sergeant Maria Santos had been observing this social positioning while conducting her own equipment inspection at Training Station 5. As the only other woman in the program besides the small corporal at Station 7, Santos understood the additional pressure that came with being a minority in elite military training environments. But Santos carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had long since proven that gender was irrelevant when it came to military competence. Santos had earned her reputation as one of the Air Force's premier weapons systems specialists. Through 12 years of service that included deployments to 6 different combat zones and advanced training in weapons systems that most ground forces never encountered. Her expertise extended beyond small arms to include crew-served weapons, explosive ordnance, and specialized systems that required security clearances that eliminated casual conversation about specific capabilities. "You know what I find interesting?" Santos said, her voice cutting through the ongoing conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms full of men, is how often people make assumptions about capability based on physical appearance. I've seen Marines who looked like they could bench press a Humvee struggle with weapons that required fine motor control, and I've seen technicians who looked like they belonged in libraries outperform infantry specialists in practical applications. Her comment created a brief pause in the conversation as several people glanced toward Training Station 7, where Jade continued her methodical preparation in apparent oblivion to the social dynamics playing out around her. The pause was subtle, but noticeable, carrying implications that everyone understood but nobody wanted to address directly. Morrison followed the glances and allowed himself a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, sure, but there are practical considerations too. I mean, you need a certain amount of physical capability to handle military-grade equipment effectively. These weapons weren't designed for..." He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. For people with certain physical limitations." Rodriguez nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting someone who was trying to be reasonable about an obvious reality. "It's not about discrimination or anything like that. It's just physics. You need grip strength to control recoil, arm strength to maintain accuracy during rapid fire, hand size to manipulate controls efficiently under stress. These are just mechanical realities of weapons design." The conversation had shifted from casual professional comparison to something more pointed, though still couched in the kind of language that could be defended as objective technical discussion. Other candidates began gravitating toward the growing group, drawn by the implicit tension and the opportunity to align themselves with what appeared to be the consensus opinion of the most experienced personnel in the room, Corporal First Class. Tommy Chun joined the discussion from Training Station 2, bringing with him the perspective of someone who had spent 4 years as a military police weapons instructor at various installations throughout the Pacific region. Chun's specialty was training soldiers who had failed initial weapons qualifications, working with personnel who struggled with standard military firearms for various reasons, ranging from inadequate prior experience to physical limitations. "I've worked with soldiers who had hand injuries, arm injuries, vision problems, all kinds of physical challenges," Chun contributed, his tone suggesting someone who was speaking from extensive practical experience. And honestly, while you can sometimes adapt techniques to work around limitations, there are just certain minimum physical requirements that can't be compromised, especially when you're talking about instructor-level proficiency. The group had grown to include 7 of the 12 candidates, with their conversation becoming increasingly focused on the practical requirements of advanced weapons training and the importance of realistic assessment of individual capabilities. The discussion remained ostensibly professional, couched in terms of safety requirements and training effectiveness, but the underlying message was becoming increasingly clear. As if summoned by the growing tension, Master Sergeant Torres appeared in the doorway leading from the administrative offices, his expression suggesting someone who had been observing the social dynamics from a distance and had decided it was time to begin the morning's actual training activities. His presence immediately shifted the room's energy from casual conversation to focused attention, as 12 candidates prepared to discover exactly what kind of challenges awaited them in the next phase of their certification process. Master Sergeant Torres moved to the center of the training floor with the measured pace of someone who had conducted thousands of weapons assessments and understood exactly how to maximize both learning and psychological pressure. His weathered hands carried a standard-issue M4 carbine, the weapon that would serve as the foundation for every advanced technique they would learn over the next 3 weeks. The rifle looked almost casual in his grip, held with the unconscious competence of someone for whom military weapons had become extensions of his own body. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres began, his voice carrying easily across the sound-dampened space, "we're going to start with baseline assessments. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to trick you or catch you off guard. Just basic field stripping. Proficiency under standard conditions. Each of you will demonstrate your ability to completely disassemble and reassemble an M4 carbine within regulation time limits." He placed the weapon on the central demonstration table where everyone could see it clearly. Standard field strip includes removing the bolt carrier group, charging handle, buffer assembly, and trigger group. Reassembly must be complete and functional with proper headspace and timing. You'll have 30 seconds for disassembly, 30 seconds for reassembly. Anyone who cannot complete both phases within time limits will receive remedial instruction before continuing with the program. The announcement seemed routine enough. Field stripping an M4 was a fundamental skill that every soldier learned during basic training. But the time constraints were tighter than most people were accustomed to, and the setting added psychological pressure that could make familiar tasks suddenly feel challenging. Torres was essentially asking them to demonstrate muscle memory under observation, with their professional reputations and program continuation dependent on performance. Morrison stepped forward first, his confident demeanor suggesting someone who viewed this as an opportunity to establish dominance rather than simply meet requirements. "Sergeant, I'll take point on this if that's acceptable. Might as well get the standards set early." Torres nodded approvingly. Morrison's approach to the demonstration table was theatrical, drawing attention to his physical presence and obvious familiarity with the weapon system. He picked up the M4 with casual authority, checking the chamber and safety with movements that spoke of extensive field experience. When Torres gave the signal to begin, Morrison moved through the disassembly sequence with aggressive efficiency, his large hands manipulating components with the kind of practice speed that came from years of combat deployments. 23 seconds for disassembly, 21 seconds for reassembly. Well within acceptable parameters, executed with enough flair to remind everyone watching that he wasn't just meeting standards, he was demonstrating mastery. "Outstanding," Torres commented, making notes on his evaluation clipboard. "That's the kind of proficiency we expect from instructor candidates." Rodriguez followed with his own demonstration, approaching the task with more technical precision than Morrison's aggressive efficiency. His movements were economical, methodical, designed to showcase proper technique rather than raw speed. 25 seconds disassembly, 24 seconds reassembly, with each component handled with textbook precision that reflected his years as a formal instructor. Santos took her turn with calm professionalism, her smaller hands moving through the sequence with fluid competence that made the weapon seem to disassemble itself. 24 seconds each direction, executed with the kind of smooth rhythm that suggested someone who had performed this task so many times that conscious thought was unnecessary. One by one, the other candidates completed their demonstrations, each performance reinforcing the growing sense that this was a room full of highly qualified military professionals who understood weapon systems at an expert level. Times ranged from 21 to 28 seconds, all well within acceptable parameters, all executed with the kind of competence that justified their selection for advanced instructor certification. Then Torres turned toward training station 7, where Jade had been observing the demonstrations with quiet attention, making occasional notes in her small notebook. "Corporal Nakamura, you're up." The subtle shift in room atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. The other candidates had completed their demonstrations to scattered nods of approval and professional recognition. But as Jade moved toward the demonstration table, the quality of attention changed from routine assessment to something that felt more like curiosity mixed with barely concealed skepticism. Morrison leaned against his training station with arms crossed, his expression suggesting someone who was about to witness something amusing. "This should be interesting," he muttered, just loud enough for nearby candidates to hear. Rodriguez positioned himself where he could observe Jade's technique closely, his expression that of someone conducting a technical evaluation. Santos maintained professional neutrality, but her attention was focused with the intensity of someone who understood the additional scrutiny that women faced in male-dominated military environments. Jade approached the demonstration table with the same measured pace she had used throughout the morning, showing no reaction to the heightened attention or subtle commentary from her classmates. She picked up the M4 with careful precision, checking chamber and safety with movements that were textbook correct, but somehow different from the casual confidence displayed by the previous demonstrators. Her hands looked impossibly small against the weapon's black polymer and metal construction. The M4 carbine had been designed for military personnel with average male hand proportions, and in Jade's grip, the size disparity was visually striking. Her fingers barely reached around the pistol grip, and her thumb had to stretch to reach the selector switch comfortably. "Jesus," Chun whispered to Morrison, "look at those hands. She can barely get a proper grip on the thing." Morrison's smile widened. "This is going to be painful to watch." Torres positioned himself where he could clearly observe both Jade's technique and the digital timer that would track her performance. "Standard field strip, Corporal. Take your time to get properly positioned, then signal when you're ready to begin." Jade spent several seconds adjusting her grip and stance, her movements careful and deliberate in a way that suggested someone who was very aware of her physical limitations and was trying to compensate through precise positioning. The weapon looked oversized in her hands, emphasizing every aspect of the physical disparity that had been the subject of earlier commentary. "Ready," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized the other demonstrations. Torres activated the timer. "Begin." What happened next was not the smooth, confident disassembly that everyone had witnessed from the previous candidates. Jade's movements were careful, methodical, but visibly constrained by the physical challenges of manipulating components that seemed designed for larger hands. She had to adjust her grip multiple times, repositioning her fingers to reach controls that the other candidates had accessed without conscious thought. The bolt carrier group extraction required her to use both hands where others had managed with one. The buffer spring removal forced her to brace the weapon against the table in a way that looked awkward and unprofessional. Each step took longer than it should have, each movement emphasizing the gap between her physical capabilities and the apparent requirements of the task. 20-8 seconds passed. Then 30, then 32. Time, Torres called, his voice neutral but carrying implications that everyone in the room understood. Jade had not completed the disassembly sequence. The weapon lay partially disassembled on the table, several components still in place. A clear failure to meet the established standard that every other candidate had achieved comfortably. The silence that followed was loaded with confirmation of every assumption that had been made about physical requirements and practical limitations. Morrison's expression was a mixture of vindication and something that might have been sympathy. Rodriguez shook his head slightly, the gesture of someone who had predicted exactly this outcome. Even Santos looked uncomfortable, caught between professional sympathy and objective assessment of demonstrated performance. Torres made additional notes on his clipboard, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts regarding what they had all just witnessed. "We'll move on to the next phase of assessment," he said matter-of-factly. "Different candidates have different strengths, and we'll be evaluating multiple skill sets before making any final determinations about program continuation." But the damage was done. Jade had failed to meet the basic standard that every other person in the room had achieved easily, confirming every doubt and justifying every assumption about the relationship between physical capability and weapons proficiency. As she returned to Training Station 7, her failure seemed to validate everything her critics had said about realistic assessment of individual limitations. The collective sigh of relief that rippled through the training facility was almost audible. Not relief for Jade, relief that the uncomfortable tension of watching someone struggle beyond their capabilities was finally over. The other candidates began to relax their postures, their expressions shifting from focused observation to the kind of sympathetic but resigned acknowledgement that follows when expectations are confirmed in the least pleasant way possible. Morrison uncrossed his arms and moved closer to Rodriguez, his voice pitched low but not quite low enough to be private. "Well, that settles that question pretty definitively. I mean, I feel bad for her, but this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. There are just physical realities that can't be ignored, especially at instructor level." Rodriguez nodded grimly, his expression that of someone who took no pleasure in being proven right. "It's not her fault, she's probably perfectly competent in her regular duties. But advanced weapons instruction requires capabilities that go beyond good intentions and careful technique. You need the physical tools to match the technical knowledge." Shun joined their quiet conversation, glancing toward Training Station 7, where Jade was methodically cleaning and organizing her equipment with the same careful attention to detail she had shown throughout the morning. "Think they'll recommend her for a different track? Maybe administrative support for the program or technical documentation?" Santos stood slightly apart from the group, her expression more conflicted than the others. As the only other woman in the program, she understood the additional weight that Jade's failure carried, not just as an individual disappointment, but as confirmation of broader doubts about women's capabilities in elite military training programs. But professional honesty compelled her to acknowledge what they had all witnessed. "The thing is," Santos said carefully, "we can't lower standards just to be inclusive. The people we train will carry these weapons in combat situations where lives depend on rapid, reliable weapon manipulation under stress. If someone can't meet basic proficiency requirements under ideal training conditions, how can we expect them to perform when bullets are flying?" The consensus was building organically, without malice or celebration, but with the inexorable weight of demonstrated reality. These were professional soldiers, not cruel people, and their assessment was based on objective performance rather than personal bias. They had all hoped Jade would succeed. Failure was never pleasant to witness, especially when it involved someone who had clearly worked hard to earn their place in the program. But but hope couldn't override physics, and good intentions couldn't substitute for measurable capability. The evidence was clear, documented, and witnessed by everyone in the room. Jade Nakamura simply did not possess the physical tools necessary for advanced weapons instruction. Regardless of her dedication or technical knowledge, Torres continued with his evaluation procedures, moving through additional assessments with other candidates. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. What had begun as a competitive environment where everyone was focused on their own performance had evolved into something more complex, a shared recognition that they were witnessing the intersection of individual limitations with institutional requirements. The remaining demonstrations proceeded smoothly, each candidate meeting or exceeding the established standards with performances that reinforced their qualifications for advanced training. But each successful completion also served as an additional reminder of the gap between adequate capability and what they had witnessed from Training Station 7. During a brief break in formal assessments, several candidates approached Torres privately to discuss their observations and concerns. These weren't complaints or attempts to exclude Jade from the program. They were professional consultations about training safety and program effectiveness that any responsible instructor would welcome. "Sergeant," Morrison said during one such conversation, "I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm concerned about safety implications if we move forward with mixed capability levels in the same training cohort. Advanced weapons instruction involves live fire exercises, stress scenarios, and time-critical procedures where any hesitation or technical difficulty could create hazards for the entire group." Rodriguez added his perspective from his experience as a formal instructor. "In my training programs, we've learned that grouping students with significantly different capability levels actually does a disservice to everyone involved. The advanced students don't get the challenge they need to improve, and the struggling students can't get the individual attention required to address their specific limitations." Torres listened to these concerns with the professional attention of someone who had spent decades balancing individual needs with program requirements. His responses were diplomatically neutral, but his questions revealed that he was taking their observations seriously and understood the broader implications of the morning's assessments. The break also provided opportunity for informal conversations among the candidates themselves, discussions that revealed the depth of their collective concern about program integrity and training effectiveness. These weren't mean-spirited exchanges or attempts to exclude someone they disliked. They were professional consultations among military personnel who understood that training standards existed for important reasons. "Look," Chun said during one such conversation, "nobody wants to see anyone fail. But we also can't pretend that good intentions are enough when we're talking about life and death skills. The people we certify as instructors will be responsible for training soldiers who will carry these weapons into combat." The weight of that responsibility hung over all their discussions. These weren't arbitrary academic standards or bureaucratic requirements. They were practical capabilities that would directly impact the effectiveness and survival of future soldiers. Lowering standards to accommodate individual limitations wasn't compassion. It was potentially dangerous to everyone who would depend on those skills in actual combat situations. As the morning progressed through additional assessments and technical evaluations, a clear pattern emerged. 11 candidates consistently demonstrated the kind of advanced proficiency that justified their selection for instructor certification. One candidate, despite obvious dedication and careful preparation, consistently struggled with basic requirements that the others met easily. The pattern was so consistent, and the performance gap so pronounced, that even the most sympathetic observers began to acknowledge the obvious conclusion. This wasn't about prejudice or unfair expectations. It was about measurable capability differences that could not be ignored or explained away. Torres made his own observations throughout the morning, documenting performance metrics and noting Technical proficiencies with the objectivity of someone who understood that military training programs succeeded or failed based on their ability to produce competent graduates. His evaluation notes reflected what everyone in the room had witnessed, clear evidence of capability, differences that would need to be addressed before the program could continue effectively. By mid-morning break, the unofficial consensus was complete. Jade Nakamura was clearly a dedicated soldier who had earned her place in the military through hard work and commitment. But equally clearly, she lacked the physical capabilities necessary for advanced weapons instructor certification. The kindest thing for everyone involved would be reassignment to a role that better matched her individual strengths and limitations. The recommendation would be professional, diplomatic, and focused on program effectiveness rather than personal criticism. But the conclusion was inescapable. Some people simply weren't suited for certain types of military specialization, regardless of their motivation or effort. What none of them realized was that they had just witnessed carefully orchestrated theater designed to confirm their biases and validate their assumptions. What they thought was conclusive evidence of limitation was actually the opening act of a demonstration that would challenge everything they believed about the relationship between physical appearance and military capability. The lunch break offered a temporary reprieve from the morning's tension. But even during casual conversation, the subject of capability assessment kept surfacing in ways that revealed how deeply the morning's demonstrations had affected everyone's thinking. Most of the candidates had gathered in small groups around the facility's break room, sharing field rations and coffee while processing what they had witnessed and discussing expectations for the afternoon's training activities. Morrison was holding court near the coffee machine, his earlier vindication having evolved into something approaching magnanimous concern. "I just hope they handle her reassignment sensitively," he said, stirring his coffee with the slow deliberation of someone who is choosing his words carefully. Nobody wants to see someone's military career damaged because they got placed in the wrong program. But even as these conversations continued, there were subtle indicators that the morning's assessments might not have told the complete story. Details that most of the candidates had missed or dismissed as irrelevant were beginning to accumulate in ways that suggested alternative interpretations of what they had witnessed. Rodriguez, who prided himself on technical observation skills, found himself thinking about Jade's equipment arrangement during the failed demonstration. "You know what was weird?" he said to Chun during a quiet moment near the vending machines. Her tools were positioned like someone who was used to working in low-light conditions. Everything positioned for tactile identification rather than visual access. Chun looked up from his sandwich with mild interest. "What do you mean?" "The way she had her cleaning kit arranged. Tools positioned by size and texture rather than by frequency of use. It's the kind of setup you see from people who work on weapon systems in situations where you can't always see what you're doing." The observation was curious rather than significant, the kind of detail that might suggest specialized training, but could equally well indicate personal preference or random habit. But it was the first crack in the seemingly solid foundation of that morning's conclusions. Santos had been observing Jade during the break, noting behavioral patterns that didn't quite match the profile of someone who had just experienced a humiliating professional failure. Instead of the dejection or defensive behavior that typically followed public demonstrations of inadequacy, Jade maintained the same calm focus she had shown throughout the morning. She spent her break time continuing her systematic examination of training equipment, but her attention had shifted to components that weren't part of standard field stripping procedures. She was studying the M4's trigger assembly with the kind of focused attention that suggested someone who understood internal mechanisms at a level that went beyond basic user maintenance. Her fingers traced component relationships with the precision of someone who had extensive experience with weapon internals, examining tolerances and clearances that most users never noticed or cared about. More intriguingly, she seemed to be making mental notes about modification points and improvement opportunities, the kind of technical assessment that suggested engineering background rather than simple user familiarity. When she thought no one was watching, she performed partial disassembly procedures that weren't part of standard training, accessing internal components with movements that spoke of extensive hands-on experience with weapon customization and optimization. Torres had been observing these behaviors from his position near the administrative office, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts but his attention, clearly focused on details that the candidates had missed. During the break, he made several phone calls that seemed routine but were conducted with the privacy protocols typically reserved for sensitive communications. The first call lasted exactly 3 minutes and was followed by a consultation with documentation that he retrieved from a locked filing cabinet. The second call involved verification procedures that required him to provide authentication codes and reference numbers that suggested he was accessing restricted information systems. The third call was brief but resulted in him making additional notes on forms that were distinctly different from the standard evaluation paperwork he had been using throughout the morning. When training resumed after lunch, Torres announced a modification to the afternoon schedule that caught everyone by surprise. "We're going to conduct some specialized assessments this afternoon that weren't part of your original course outline. These will be voluntary exercises designed to evaluate advanced technical capabilities that go beyond standard instructor requirements." The announcement created a buzz of interest among the candidates, who interpreted this as an opportunity to demonstrate additional qualifications that might distinguish them from their classmates. Advanced assessments typically meant opportunities to showcase specialized skills that could lead to elite assignment opportunities or accelerated career advancement. The first specialized assessment will focus on advanced disassembly techniques under non-standard conditions, Torres continued. This will include partial blindfold work, time compression exercises, and technical problem-solving scenarios that simulate field conditions where standard procedures might not be applicable. Morrison's interest was immediately engaged. Specialized training scenarios were exactly the kind of challenge where his combat experience provided significant advantages over candidates who had primarily peacetime training backgrounds. "Sergeant, are these assessments competitive or individual skill demonstrations?" "Individual assessments," Torres replied, "but documented for potential advanced placement opportunities. Anyone who demonstrates exceptional capability in these specialized areas may be recommended for accelerated progression or additional training opportunities." The prospect of accelerated advancement created immediate enthusiasm among candidates who understood that elite military training programs often served as gateways to career opportunities that weren't available through standard progression channels. Advanced instructor certification could lead to assignments with special operations units, foreign military training missions, or developmental programs for next-generation weapon systems. But there was something about Torres's demeanor that suggested these specialized assessments weren't simply additional opportunities for competitive advancement. His attention kept returning to Training Station 7, where Jade continued her methodical preparation with the same focused intensity she had maintained throughout the day. During equipment preparation for the afternoon assessments, Jade's behavior began to reveal additional anomalies that didn't fit the profile of someone who had struggled with basic requirements. She examined the blindfold material with the attention of someone who understood exactly how different fabric densities and weave patterns affected tactile sensitivity. She tested the weight and balance of various M4 configurations with movements that suggested extensive experience with weapon customization and performance optimization. Most tellingly, she spent several minutes examining the timing mechanisms that would be used for the advanced assessments. Her attention focused on calibration details and measurement precision with the thoroughness of someone who understood that accurate performance Documentation required reliable instrumentation. The other candidates interpreted her continued focus and preparation as admirable persistence in the face of obvious limitations, the behavior of someone who refused to give up despite clear evidence that she was out of her depth. But there were subtle indicators that suggested an alternative interpretation, the behavior of someone who was preparing for a demonstration that would require precision beyond anything they had witnessed that morning. When Torres called for final preparation for the specialized assessments, the room's energy shifted from casual confidence to focused attention. But the quality of that attention was different now, charged with anticipation that something significant was about to happen, though nobody could have predicted exactly what form that significance would take. As candidates took their positions for what they assumed would be another series of competitive demonstrations designed to separate the exceptional from the merely competent, the stage was set for revelations that would fundamentally challenge everything they thought they understood about military capability and the relationship between physical appearance and technical expertise. Torres moved to the center of the training floor carrying a black tactical blindfold and a stopwatch that looked more precise than the standard timing equipment they had used that morning. His expression carried the focused intensity of someone who was about to conduct an assessment that went far beyond routine training evaluation. The afternoon light streaming through the facility's windows had shifted, casting longer shadows. That created an almost theatrical atmosphere in the sound-dampened space. This specialized assessment will test advanced disassembly capabilities under conditions that simulate field operations where visual confirmation is not available, Torres announced, his voice carrying an authority that commanded absolute attention. The candidate will be blindfolded and challenged to field strip an M4 carbine to complete component level within a time constraint that represents tactical necessity rather than training convenience. He paused, allowing the implications to settle. Complete component level disassembly went far beyond the basic field stripping they had performed that morning. It involved removing not just the major assemblies, but breaking down the bolt carrier group into individual components, disassembling the trigger mechanism, and separating the buffer system into its constituent parts. Even experienced weapons technicians typically required visual confirmation for such detailed work. The time limit for this assessment is 15 seconds. The announcement created a moment of stunned silence. 15 seconds for complete disassembly was not just challenging, it bordered on impossible. Most experienced soldiers required several minutes for complete component breakdown under ideal conditions with full visual access. Attempting such a task blindfolded within 15 seconds seemed like an exercise designed to demonstrate the limits of human capability rather than evaluate practical skills. Morrison's confident expression faltered for the first time all day. "Sergeant, with respect, 15 seconds seems ambitious, even for someone with extensive combat experience." Rodriguez nodded in agreement, his technical background making him acutely aware of the complexity involved in complete weapon disassembly. The number of individual components and the precision required for proper separation. "I'm not sure that's physically possible within that time frame, even with unlimited practice." Torres's response was a slight smile that suggested he knew something they didn't. Sometimes our assumptions about what's possible are limited by our own experience rather than actual capability limits. This assessment is designed to identify exceptional talent that might not be apparent through standard evaluation methods. He turned toward the group of candidates, his gaze settling with particular attention on Training Station 7. "The assessment is voluntary. Anyone who wishes to attempt this challenge may do so, but failure will not impact your program standing, since the requirements exceed standard instructor certification levels." The offer hung in the air like a challenge that nobody quite wanted to accept, but nobody wanted to decline. This was clearly an opportunity to demonstrate elite-level capabilities, But it was also a setup for very public failure that could undermine confidence and reputation. Morrison stepped forward first, his competitive nature overriding his tactical. "Caution, I'll give it a shot, Sergeant. Might as well see what's possible." The blindfold was secured carefully, blocking all visual input while allowing normal breathing and hearing. Torres placed the M4 on the table in standard position, checked his stopwatch, and gave the signal to begin. Morrison's movements were confident initially, his hands finding familiar components with the muscle memory developed through years of combat experience. The major assemblies came apart smoothly. Bolt carrier group extracted, charging handle removed, buffer assembly withdrawn. But as he moved toward the more complex internal components, his progress slowed dramatically. The trigger mechanism required visual confirmation for proper disassembly, and the bolt carrier components were too intricate for blind manipulation. At 15 seconds, he had achieved perhaps 60% of complete disassembly, an impressive performance that exceeded what most soldiers could accomplish under similar conditions. But clearly incomplete. Rodriguez attempted the challenge next, his technical background providing advantages in understanding component relationships and assembly sequences. His approach was more methodical than Morrison's aggressive attack. But the results were similar. Excellent progress on major assemblies, but incomplete breakdown of complex internal mechanisms within the time constraint. Santos's attempt was equally impressive and equally incomplete. Chun managed roughly the same level of disassembly. One by one, the other candidates tried and failed to achieve complete component breakdown within 15 seconds, each performance demonstrating exceptional skill while highlighting the apparent impossibility of the challenge. Then Torres turned toward Training Station 7, with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for this moment throughout the entire day. "Corporal Nakamura, would you like to attempt this assessment?" The question created another moment of uncomfortable silence. Everyone in the room had witnessed Jade's struggle with basic field stripping that morning. The idea that she might succeed, where experienced combat veterans and technical specialists had failed, seemed beyond unlikely. It seemed almost cruel to invite such obvious failure. Jade looked up from her equipment, preparation with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the day. "Yes, Sergeant. I'd like to try." Morrison's expression was a mixture of admiration for her persistence and concern about witnessing another public failure. "Corporal, this is significantly more complex than the morning assessment. Maybe you want to observe a few more attempts before." "I'm ready," Jade said simply, moving toward the demonstration table with the same measured pace she had used all day. Torres secured the blindfold carefully, ensuring complete visual obstruction while maintaining her comfort and breathing. The M4 was positioned in standard configuration, identical to the setup used for all previous attempts. The room fell silent with the kind of focused attention that preceded moments of high drama or anticipated disaster. 15 seconds for complete component disassembly, Torres repeated, his hand positioned over the stopwatch. "Signal when ready." Jade's hands hovered over the weapon for a moment, not hesitating but performing some kind of mental preparation that suggested ritual or routine rather than uncertainty. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, the respiratory pattern of someone managing stress through techniques that went beyond standard military training. "Ready," she said quietly. "Begin." What happened next defied every assumption, exceeded every expectation, and challenged every conclusion that had been drawn about capability and limitation throughout the entire day. Jade's hands moved across the weapon with movements so fluid, so precise, so impossibly fast that they seemed almost mechanical in their efficiency. The bolt carrier group wasn't just extracted, it was simultaneously disassembled into firing pin, bolt, cam pin, and carrier components, while her other hand was removing the charging handle and beginning buffer disassembly. Her fingers found components with the certainty of someone who could navigate weapon internals in absolute darkness. Not through careful exploration, but through perfect spatial memory and tactile familiarity. The trigger mechanism, which had stopped every other candidate, separated into its constituent parts under her touch like a puzzle that solved. 5 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds. Component after component appeared on the table in organized rows, separated not randomly but arranged in logical assembly groups that demonstrated complete understanding of mechanical relationships and rebuild sequences. Springs, pins, washers, and complex machined parts emerged from the weapon with movements so economical that her hands seemed to be performing multiple operations simultaneously. 12 seconds, 13 seconds, 14 seconds, the final component. A tiny detent spring that most soldiers didn't even know existed was placed carefully in its designated position with 1 second to spare. Time, Torres called, but his voice was barely audible over the complete silence that had fallen over the room. The M4 carbine lay on the table, completely disassembled down to individual components, organized with the precision of a technical manual illustration. 37 separate parts arranged in perfect order, each one removed and positioned without a single moment of hesitation or uncertainty. Jade removed the blindfold and looked around the room at faces that were frozen in expressions of shock, disbelief, and dawning recognition that everything they thought they knew about her capabilities had been completely, dramatically, impossibly wrong. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, broken finally by the sound of Rodriguez's clipboard hitting the floor as his nerveless fingers simply stopped working. The sharp clatter echoed through the sound-dampened room like a gunshot, startling everyone back into awareness that they were still breathing, still present, still witnessing something that their minds were struggling to process. Morrison took an involuntary step backward, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching fear as he stared at the perfectly arranged components on the demonstration table. That's not possible," he whispered, his voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier commentary. "Nobody can disassemble a weapon that fast. Nobody." Chun moved closer to the table, his eyes scanning the organized array of parts with the desperate attention of someone hoping to find evidence of error or illusion. But every component was there, properly separated, correctly oriented, arranged with the kind of systematic precision that suggested not just technical competence but absolute mastery of weapon mechanics at a level that exceeded anything taught in standard military training. "Jesus Christ," Santos breathed, her professional composure cracking as she began to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. She didn't just disassemble it. She organized the components by reassembly sequence while she was taking it apart. That requires understanding internal relationships at an engineering level. The room's atmosphere had shifted from shocked silence to something approaching panic as the other candidates began to realize that everything they thought they understood about capability assessment, military training, and their own professional competence had just been fundamentally challenged by a performance that shouldn't have been humanly possible. Rodriguez retrieved his clipboard with shaking hands, his technical background making him perhaps more aware than the others of exactly how extraordinary Jade's demonstration had been. The trigger mechanism alone. There are at least 12 separate components in there, and some of them are under spring tension. Disassembling that blindfolded without losing parts or damaging springs requires knowledge of internal configurations that most armorer specialists don't possess. Torres had been observing the candidates' reactions with the focused attention of someone who understood that what they were witnessing was as much about the observers as it was about the demonstration. He moved to a secure communication panel mounted near the administrative entrance and activated what appeared to be a priority notification system. "Command, this is Training Facility C7, he said into the handset, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone reporting critical information. "We have a confirmed Level Alpha performance indicator. Request immediate administrative review and verification protocols. The terminology meant nothing to most of the candidates, but the urgency in Torres's voice and the fact that he was bypassing normal reporting channels suggested that Jade's performance had triggered institutional responses that went far beyond routine training assessment. Within minutes, activity throughout the facility began to change in ways that indicated something significant was happening. Additional personnel began appearing in the hallway outside the training room, not casual observers, but individuals in dress uniforms carrying folders marked with security classifications that suggested official documentation rather than routine paperwork. Radio traffic increased noticeably, with encrypted communications that carried the clipped urgency of priority. Military operations. Morrison found himself struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he believed about military capability and training progression. "Sergeant, I don't understand what just happened. That level of performance. That's not something you learn in standard military occupational specialty training. That's specialized technical knowledge that takes years to develop." "You're absolutely right," Torres replied, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts, but his tone suggesting that Morrison had identified exactly the correct question. "That performance represents capabilities that are typically restricted to very specialized military applications." The implications began to cascade through the room as individual candidates started to understand that they weren't just witnessing exceptional individual performance. They were observing something that suggested background, training, and expertise that hadn't been disclosed during standard program briefings. Chun's voice was barely above a whisper as he voiced what everyone was beginning to suspect. "What kind of military assignment requires that level of weapons expertise? That's not infantry training. That's not even special operations standard. That's something else entirely." Santos had moved to examine the disassembled components more closely, her expression that of someone trying to understand technical details that exceeded her own considerable expertise. "Look at the way she positioned the firing pin components. She didn't just remove them. She arranged them to show the wear patterns and tolerance relationships. That's diagnostic level assessment capability." The administrative activity outside the training room was intensifying, with personnel movements that suggested coordination between multiple departments and possibly external agencies. Through the reinforced windows, they could see additional vehicles arriving in the facility's secure parking area, official sedans with government plates and communication equipment that indicated involvement of personnel who didn't typically participate in routine training activities. Rodriguez was still studying his notes from the morning's assessments, trying to reconcile Jade's apparent struggle with basic field stripping against the impossible demonstration they had just witnessed. The morning performance, that wasn't incompetence. That was deliberate. She was controlling her performance to meet expectations rather than demonstrate actual capability. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Everything they had witnessed, every assumption they had made, every conclusion they had drawn about limitation and capability had been based on a carefully orchestrated deception designed to confirm their biases and validate their preconceptions. Morrison's face had gone pale as he began to understand the scope of what had been manipulated. "She let us think. She made us believe. Why would someone deliberately fail an assessment they could have passed easily?" Torres's radio crackled with encrypted communications that he acknowledged with brief, coded responses. Whatever was happening was clearly escalating beyond the scope of routine training evaluation, involving levels of institutional response that suggested Jade's identity and capabilities were matters of considerable official interest. "There's going to be a brief administrative hold while we process some documentation irregularities," Torres announced, his carefully neutral tone suggesting that administrative irregularities was a significant understatement. "All candidates will remain in the training facility until further notice." The phrase, "until further notice," carried implications that made several candidates exchange worried glances. Military administrative holds typically meant that someone's security status, background verification, or program authorization was being reviewed at levels that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Chun voiced what several others were thinking. "Sergeant, are we talking about security clearance issues? Background investigation problems? We're talking about making sure everyone understands exactly who they've been training alongside," Torres replied, his expression suggesting that the morning's assumptions about Jade's background were about to be corrected in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about military specialization and classified operations. Outside the training room, the sound of additional personnel arriving and the sight of increasingly official-looking documentation suggested that whatever revelation was coming would fundamentally change their understanding not just of Jade's capabilities, but of the entire context surrounding their presence in this particular training program. The candidates found themselves in the uncomfortable position of waiting for explanations about someone they had dismissed as inadequately qualified, while beginning to suspect that they might be the ones whose qualifications were actually in question. The double doors at the far end of the training facility opened with the kind of authority that announced the arrival of someone whose presence would fundamentally alter the dynamics of whatever situation they had. Additional personnel began appearing in the hallway outside the training room, not casual observers, but individuals in dress uniforms carrying folders marked with security classifications that suggested official documentation rather than routine paperwork. Radio traffic increased noticeably, with encrypted communications that carried the clipped urgency of priority. Military operations. Morrison found himself struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he believed about military capability and training progression. "Sergeant, I don't understand what just happened. That level of performance. That's not something you learn in standard military occupational specialty training. That's specialized technical knowledge that takes years to develop." "You're absolutely right," Torres replied, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts, but his tone suggesting that Morrison had identified exactly the correct question. "That performance represents capabilities that are typically restricted to very specialized military applications." The implications began to cascade through the room as individual candidates started to understand that they weren't just witnessing exceptional individual performance. They were observing something that suggested background, training, and expertise that hadn't been disclosed during standard program briefings. Chun's voice was barely above a whisper as he voiced what everyone was beginning to suspect. "What kind of military assignment requires that level of weapons expertise? That's not infantry training. That's not even special operations standard. That's something else entirely." Santos had moved to examine the disassembled components more closely, her expression that of someone trying to understand technical details that exceeded her own considerable expertise. "Look at the way she positioned the firing pin components. She didn't just remove them. She arranged them to show the wear patterns and tolerance relationships. That's diagnostic level assessment capability." The administrative activity outside the training room was intensifying, with personnel movements that suggested coordination between multiple departments and possibly external agencies. Through the reinforced windows, they could see additional vehicles arriving in the facility's secure parking area, official sedans with government plates and communication equipment that indicated involvement of personnel who didn't typically participate in routine training activities. Rodriguez was still studying his notes from the morning's assessments, trying to reconcile Jade's apparent struggle with basic field stripping against the impossible demonstration they had just witnessed. The morning performance, that wasn't incompetence. That was deliberate. She was controlling her performance to meet expectations rather than demonstrate actual capability. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Everything they had witnessed, every assumption they had made, Every conclusion they had drawn about limitation and capability had been based on a carefully orchestrated deception designed to confirm their biases and validate their preconceptions. Morrison's face had gone pale as he began to understand the scope of what had been manipulated. She let us think. She made us believe. Why would someone deliberately fail an assessment they could have passed easily? Torres's radio crackled with encrypted communications that he acknowledged with brief, coded responses. Whatever was happening was clearly escalating beyond the scope of routine training evaluation, involving levels of institutional response that suggested Jade's identity and capabilities were matters of considerable official interest. There's going to be a brief administrative hold while we process some documentation irregularities, Torres announced, his carefully neutral tone suggesting that administrative irregularities was a significant understatement. All candidates will remain in the training facility until further notice. The phrase, until further notice, carried implications that made several candidates exchange worried glances. Military administrative holds typically meant that someone's security status, background verification, or Morrison found his voice, though it carried none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier commentary. Ma'am, with respect, how is it possible that someone with those qualifications was assigned to a basic instructor certification program? That seems like significant overqualification. Colonel Hawthorne's smile was slight but unmistakably knowing. Corporal Nakamura wasn't assigned to this program for certification purposes. She was assigned to conduct assessment and evaluation of current training methodologies, instructional effectiveness, and institutional bias patterns that might affect program outcomes and military readiness. The implications began cascading through the room as individual candidates realized that they hadn't just been participating in routine training assessment, they had been subjects of evaluation themselves, observed and assessed by someone whose qualifications exceeded those of most senior military instructors. Rodriguez's technical background made him perhaps the first to fully grasp the scope of what had been revealed. We were being tested. Not just our weapon skills, our judgment, our professional assessment capabilities, our response to non-standard situations. Precisely, Dr. Williams confirmed. Her attention still focused on the weapon components, but her voice directed toward the group. Military effectiveness depends not just on individual technical competence, but on accurate assessment of capability and appropriate utilization of available human resources. Institutional bias that results in misallocation of personnel represents a strategic vulnerability that affects operational readiness. Santos was staring at Jade with an expression that mixed professional admiration with something approaching embarrassment. The morning assessment. When you struggled with basic field stripping ... That was deliberate performance management to establish baseline assumptions for behavioral observation. Jade spoke for the first time since completing her demonstration, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the day, but now contextualized by the revelation of her actual background and capabilities. Understanding how institutional bias affects personnel assessment requires creating controlled conditions where those biases can be observed and documented. This morning provided baseline data about assumption patterns and decision-making processes that affect training effectiveness. Major General Chun opened his folder and began reading from documentation that clearly represented official findings, rather than casual observation. Initial assessment protocols demonstrated consistent pattern recognition regarding physical capability assumptions, with 11 of 12 candidates making evaluation decisions based primarily on visual indicators, rather than demonstrated performance metrics. The weight of official documentation and institutional analysis was settling over the room as candidates began to understand that their morning's casual commentary and professional observations had been recorded, analyzed, and included in reports. That would likely affect future training program development, and possibly their own career progression. Chun continued reading from his notes. Remedial training recommendations include enhanced instruction and capability assessment methodology, bias recognition training, and professional development regarding inclusive evaluation practices that prioritize demonstrated competence over demographic indicators. Colonel Hawthorne positioned herself where she could address each candidate directly, her expression carrying the serious attention of someone delivering information that would have lasting professional implications. Effective immediately, all personnel participating in this assessment will receive additional training in personnel evaluation methodologies and professional development, opportunities designed to address identified gaps in assessment accuracy and institutional effectiveness. The room had become completely silent except for the sound of official documentation being prepared and the distant hum of facility systems that suddenly seemed much louder in the absence of conversation. Each candidate was processing not just the revelation of Jade's true background, but the implications of their own observed behavior and documented responses during what they had assumed was routine training. Evaluation. The morning's confident assertions about physical limitations and capability requirements now appeared in official records as examples of institutional bias that required correction through additional education and professional development. A revelation that would follow them throughout their military careers and affect future assignment and advancement opportunities. The formal briefing concluded with Colonel Hawthorne's signature on documents that would become part of each candidate's permanent military record. But the real resolution began in the minutes that followed as individual personalities processed what they had learned and began the difficult work of reconciling their assumptions with demonstrated reality. The room's atmosphere had shifted from official documentation to something more personal, the uncomfortable but necessary process of professional growth that followed moments of profound educational humility. Morrison was the first to approach Jade directly, his earlier confidence replaced by the kind of careful respect that comes from understanding you fundamentally misjudged someone's capabilities. His walk across the training floor seemed longer than the actual distance, weighted by the recognition that every casual comment and dismissive assumption from the morning was now documented in official reports that would affect both their careers. "Corporal," he said, his voice carrying none of the casual authority that had characterized his earlier interactions. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. My assessment of your capabilities was based on assumptions that were not just wrong, but professionally inappropriate." Jade's response was gracious, but not dismissive of the seriousness of what had occurred. The purpose of the assessment was to document natural response patterns under controlled conditions. Your reactions provided valuable data about institutional bias patterns that affect personnel utilization and training effectiveness. Morrison's expression showed he understood that her diplomatic response didn't minimize the professional implications of his documented behavior. "Still, my commentary this morning reflected judgment based on physical appearance rather than demonstrated competence. That's a leadership failure that I need to address through additional training and personal development." Rodriguez joined the conversation, his technical background making him perhaps more aware than the others of exactly how extraordinary Jade's demonstrated capabilities had been. "Corporal, I'm struggling to understand the scope of your actual expertise. The disassembly technique you demonstrated requires understanding of mechanical tolerances and component relationships that goes beyond anything taught in standard military programs. My background includes specialized education in weapons, systems engineering, and mechanical analysis that's typically reserved for research and development applications." Jade replied, her tone remaining professional, but now contextualized by the official revelation of her credentials. "The rapid disassembly techniques are necessary for field assessment of weapon condition and performance optimization under tactical conditions." Santos approached with the particular attention of someone who understood the additional challenges that women faced in elite military training environments. I have to ask, how difficult was it to deliberately limit your performance this morning? Watching you struggle with basic field stripping when you clearly possess expert-level capabilities must have required significant self-control. Jade's smile was slight but genuine. The most challenging aspect was maintaining consistent performance limitations while ensuring that the assessment data would be meaningful for research purposes. Deliberate underperformance requires as much precision as optimal performance, just applied in different directions. Chun had been observing these individual conversations while processing his own recognition of the morning's events. The implications for training program development. If institutional bias affects capability assessment to this degree, how many qualified personnel are being misallocated or underutilized because of similar assumption patterns? Dr. Williams, who had been documenting the weapon components with scientific precision, looked up from her technical analysis to address Qian's question. Current research suggests that capability misassessment affects approximately 30% of personnel assignments, with particular impact on individuals whose physical characteristics don't match traditional expectations for their areas of expertise. The conversation had evolved from individual apologies to broader discussion of institutional implications, but the personal dimensions remained central to the resolution process. Each candidate was processing not just a revelation of Jade's background, but the documentation of their own response patterns and the professional development requirements that would follow. Torres, who had observed the entire assessment process from his position as lead instructor, provided additional context about the broader purpose of the research program. This evaluation was part of a comprehensive study being conducted across multiple training facilities to identify bias patterns that affect military readiness and operational effectiveness. The data collected today will contribute to development of improved assessment protocols and instructor training programs. The weight of contributing to institutional research added another dimension to the morning's events, transforming what had felt like personal embarrassment into participation in efforts to improve military effectiveness and personnel utilization. But the individual responsibility for documented bias remained a significant factor in each candidate's professional development planning. Colonel Hawthorne returned to the training floor after completing her official documentation, her presence providing opportunity for direct interaction between command authority and the personnel who had participated in the assessment. I want to emphasize that the purpose of this research is institutional improvement, not individual punishment. However, the behaviors documented today do require attention through professional development and additional training. Morrison straightened to attention. Ma'am, speaking for myself, I request the most comprehensive bias recognition training available. This morning's events demonstrated gaps in my professional judgment that could affect my effectiveness as an instructor and leader. Request noted and approved, Hawthorne replied. All personnel will receive individualized development plans based on their documented response patterns and professional growth needs. The resolution process continued as individual candidates engaged in direct conversation with Jade, each interaction characterized by the kind of professional respect that should have been present from the beginning, but was now informed by accurate understanding of her qualifications and expertise. Rodriguez found himself asking technical questions about weapon modification and performance optimization that revealed the depth of knowledge that had been hidden behind the morning's carefully managed performance limitations. Santos engaged in discussion about the challenges of capability assessment in environments where bias affected evaluation accuracy. Shun explored the implications for training program development and institutional policy modification throughout these conversations. Jade maintained the same professional demeanor she had shown all day, but now contextualized by official recognition of her expertise and institutional validation of her research contributions. The morning's dismissive treatment had been transformed into appropriate recognition of exceptional capabilities, and specialized knowledge. The afternoon's formal assessments were postponed, pending completion of administrative processing and development of individualized training plans that would address identified areas for professional growth. The remaining program activities would be restructured to incorporate lessons learned from the bias assessment research and to ensure that future evaluations would prioritize demonstrated competence over demographic assumptions. As the formal resolution process concluded, the training facility had been transformed from a routine certification program into a case study in institutional bias recognition and professional development planning that would influence training protocols at facilities throughout the military system. 3 weeks later, Jade Nakamura walked through the same glass doors of the Advanced Weapons Systems Training Center, but everything about the experience was fundamentally different. The morning air still carried the crisp bite of autumn, and the facility maintained its atmosphere of military precision. But the quality of attention she received reflected accurate understanding of her qualifications rather than assumptions. Based on physical appearance, her assignment to the training facility had been extended, not as a student requiring certification, but as a senior technical advisor responsible for implementing the bias recognition training protocols that had been developed based on her research findings. The morning's events 3 weeks earlier had generated reports that reached the highest levels of military command, resulting in policy changes that would affect personnel assessment procedures at training facilities throughout the entire military system. The candidates from her original assessment group had completed their modified certification program with additional training modules focused on capability assessment methodology and bias recognition. Their individual development plans had been implemented with the kind of institutional support that transformed professional embarrassment into genuine educational opportunity, creating leaders who would be better equipped to identify and utilize exceptional talent, regardless of its presentation. Morrison had requested assignment to the new bias recognition training program as an instructor, his experience serving as a powerful example of how assumptions could affect professional judgment, even among experienced military personnel. His transformation from confident skeptic to thoughtful educator represented exactly the kind of institutional learning that the research had been designed to promote. Rodriguez had incorporated advanced capability assessment techniques into his instructor certification curriculum, developing evaluation methods that prioritize demonstrated competence over traditional indicators. His technical background, combined with lessons learned from the assessment experience, made him particularly effective at training other instructors to recognize expertise that might not conform to expected patterns. Santos had been selected for advancement to senior instructor positions where her experience with institutional bias would contribute to development of more inclusive training environments. Her perspective as someone who understood both the challenges of minority representation and the importance of maintaining rigorous standards made her invaluable for institutional policy development. The research findings from their assessment had been incorporated into training protocols at 17 different facilities, with implementation plans for system-wide adoption of improved evaluation methodologies. The morning's events had contributed to institutional changes that would affect thousands of military personnel over the coming years, transforming individual learning into systemic improvement. Dr. Williams had used the assessment data to develop advanced weapons training programs that recognize diverse types of expertise and capability presentation. Her research had demonstrated that traditional assessment methods were systematically underutilizing personnel whose capabilities didn't conform to standard expectations, representing significant waste of human resources and potential operational vulnerabilities. The facility itself had been designated as a center of excellence for bias recognition training, with Jade serving as lead technical advisor for program development and implementation. Her role involved not just training individual instructors, but developing institutional procedures that would ensure accurate capability assessment, Regardless of demographic factors or traditional expectations, Colonel Hawthorne had been promoted to oversee implementation of the new assessment protocols throughout the military training system. Her leadership of the research program, having demonstrated the operational importance of addressing institutional bias at the policy level. The documentation from Jade's assessment had provided compelling evidence for command-level changes that had been recommended for years, but never implemented with sufficient institutional support. On this morning, Jade entered the facility not as someone whose capabilities were being questioned, but as the acknowledged expert responsible for ensuring that future assessments would accurately identify and utilize exceptional talent. The transformation from dismissed candidate to institutional authority represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated the possibility of systemic change when individual experiences contributed to broader organizational learning. Training room where she had been subjected to dismissive commentary now displayed her photograph among the facility's distinguished instructors, her credentials listed in full detail rather than hidden behind administrative cover. The weapons demonstration table where she had been expected to fail now served as the centerpiece for advanced assessment training where instructors learned to recognize expertise regardless of its presentation. The lesson had extended far beyond the individuals who had witnessed her demonstration. Military personnel throughout the system were now receiving training that emphasized the danger of capability assumptions and the importance of evidence-based assessment. The morning's events had generated institutional memory that would influence military culture for decades, creating awareness that exceptional talent often appeared in unexpected forms. Jade's morning routine now included reviewing assessment data from facilities where the new protocols were being implemented, tracking improvements in personnel utilization, and identifying areas where additional training was needed. Her work had evolved from individual research participation to system-wide influence on military effectiveness and operational readiness. The candidates she occasionally encountered in the facility's hallways treated her with the professional respect appropriate for someone whose expertise had been officially recognized and institutionally validated. But more importantly, their training now included education that would prevent them from making similar assumptions about future personnel, whose capabilities might not conform to traditional expectations. The true measure of success wasn't the individual recognition or career advancement that had followed the assessment, but the institutional changes that would affect countless military personnel who would never know that their more accurate evaluation and appropriate utilization resulted from lessons learned during a single morning when assumptions collided with reality in the most dramatic way possible. The story that had begun with laughter about tiny hands and dismissive comments about physical limitations had evolved into institutional policy changes that recognized talent regardless of its presentation. The morning's documentation of bias had been transformed into educational materials that would improve military effectiveness by ensuring that exceptional capabilities were accurately identified and properly utilized. As Jade began another day of training instructors to recognize expertise wherever it appeared, she carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose professional experience had contributed to positive change that extended far beyond personal vindication. The lesson about respect, accurate assessment, and the danger of assumptions had become part of military culture, ensuring that future personnel would benefit from more inclusive and effective evaluation procedures. Have you ever witnessed someone surprise everyone with capabilities that nobody expected? Have you found yourself making assumptions about someone's abilities based on first impressions that turned out to be completely wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better recognize talent that doesn't conform to traditional expectations. If this story reminded you that respect should be given freely and that extraordinary capabilities often come in unexpected packages, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about hidden expertise and the importance of accurate assessment. And if you know someone whose talents have been underestimated because they don't fit conventional expectations, share this video with them because the most remarkable abilities are often found in the most surprising places. Other stories about recognition, respect, and the danger of assumptions are waiting on your screen. Watch those next, and we'll see you tomorrow right here for more tales of quiet dignity and exceptional capability that prove that talent has no standard appearance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.